wanted to start with actually a metaphor. This is not a picture of my home, but it's showing something important about my home. You see there, you have grass that's subdivided and trees and bushes that are subdivided by a central sidewalk. That's similar to my home. Then on each side, you see trees, partial trees, but you see the larger trees that perhaps could have been there for 100 years. Now we're going to move into the metaphor that is related to my own experience in my yard. So just have a picture of that. The trees on the side, the large majestic trees, and grass on each side. When at my home, I first noticed the grass. It was not thriving or growing on one side of my house. It was beginning to die. Then the tree, one of those majestic trees, was showing signs of decay. A branch nearly fell on a visitor as he got out of his car.
Doctor.
Neighbors wanted me to remove this majestic tree. I objected. This tree was providing such important shade for my home, and it had been there for over 100 years. What a legacy. I came back from the East Coast at the start of the pandemic to a new sidewalk, a gas leak, and a tree scheduled for removal. In improving the sidewalk, an improvement and change that was intended to enhance the property, an underlying problem was found. The problem had already been affecting the grass and the tree and causing harm on the surface. But looking below the surface revealed an inescapable and even more destructive force. I had seen the effects of this force over time and chosen not to act, as I was focused on preserving the tree. My behavior and inattention to harm actually worsened the problem and resulted in a more drastic intervention. I had no control at that point. The gas leak was repaired even when I wasn't home. The tree was scheduled for removal. So what's the update on this? The grass on the dying side has revived and will survive and is surviving. The other side, the green tree, is fine and the grass is growing. And that tree and grass might understandably wonder, what's all the fuss about? We're doing fine. Now, in this story, my question is, where is your focus? I clearly confessed mine was on the majestic tree that's dying and trying to preserve it because it had provided shade for my home. That's one focus. Another focus might be the dying grass. The grass was dying, but maybe we just give it more water. Just keep on giving it more water, more water. It'll come back to life. Is your focus on the toxic gas? You can't see it. Is it really there? But its effects are inescapable. Or is your focus on the tree, and gas?
Dr. Right now we can only see the first slide.
Okay. So it's okay because I'm going to move on.
Oh, okay,
to it.
sorry.
Okay.
I wasn't
but thank you for
okay.
letting me know that. I was trying to come out of it, right. Okay. So the reality is, if we do not address the toxicity on the other side that the tree and grass were affected by, it would only be a matter of time before the tree and grass on the other side would have died as well. Social injustice infects the ground we all stand on. It stunts our growth, and it's a destructive force. If we can face it, address it, we can have common ground so we all can thrive. Now, the hope is you'll see the next slide full view. Is that good? Okay. So these are the areas that I will be discussing. Cultivating a posture of positive listening in the midst of polarity, common challenges we share and face in our shared pain, process of change, cultural competence, and social justice competence, and implications for the future. Our ethical code, one of the principles is justice. I think that's something we often forget. It's right there in our ethical code, and is preceded by integrity, where we seek accuracy, honesty in the science, teaching, and practice of psychology. But look at what's said here related to fairness and justice, how do all persons access to and benefit from the contributions of psychology and equal quality. And then what's italicized, exercise reasonable judgment, take precautions to ensure that our potential biases, the boundaries of our competence, and the limitations of our expertise do not lead to or condone unjust practices. Well, in these polarizing times, and more polarizing than imaginable, really, it's not easy to listen in regular kind of when life is not so polarized and times are not so polarized. But it's even harder to listen in more polarized times. It's harder to listen when you feel threatened, harmed, unheard, dismissed, accused. For me, this past 20 months, and particularly following the murder of George Floyd, I was traumatized in a way that I've never been from a racial standpoint. I had to retreat. I had to try to find rest, nourishment, and for me, beauty, placing after mourning, placing beautiful things around me. I've had to cultivate that more. So one of the pieces about listening, we're not always ready to listen. And given the times, we shouldn't expect ourselves to be always ready to listen. But when we take that time apart, it can bring us back with more capacity for listening. In these polarizing times, we need to listen even more deeply. We know what empathic listening involves. Well, I think chaplains teach us some important lessons in this study of chaplains about embodied listening. Yes, with our bodies, eye contact, all those nonverbal signs. But I love this quote: I'll stay with your story, your emotions, rather than rush off, leaving you alone with no one to listen, with your tears, fears, and tales of unknown futures. That's a whole nother level of listening, and the emotional part is a critical dimension of this. Pushing further to listening, because it's one thing to listen in general, listen to emotion, but in the midst of deeply felt pain. Isabel Wilkerson talks about radical empathy in her book, Cast. Means putting in the work to educate oneself and listen with a humble heart to understand another's experience from their perspective, not as we would imagine we'd feel. Radical empathy is not about what you think you would do in a situation you've never been in and perhaps never will. It's the kindred connection from a place of deep knowing that opens your spirit to the pain of another as they perceive it. Well, what is some of the pain? I alluded to already, racial trauma, especially over this past year and a half. It refers to and is referring to it for people of color, indigenous individuals, includes threats of harm and injury, humiliating and shaming events, witnessing racial discrimination toward others, and the ongoing cyclical, collective, cumulative, repetitive exposure and re-exposure to race-based stress and trauma. Racial microaggressions are powerful too. When Pierce first talked about it, he wasn't trying to say they are minor as much as those 10 million cuts add up to a major gash. It's those smaller things that also have an impact. So Sue has then taken this further, and there are many more dimensions that have been articulated, but racial microaggressions, brief, commonplace, daily, verbal, behavioral, environmental indignities, whether intentional or unintentional. Now I want to pause here and communicate these negative, hostile slights and insults. It's sometimes not an intent of a person to harm, but the impact can still be profound and hurtful. We have to attend to all of that. Now, Sue highlights that even talking about race, talking about social justice, starts to violate this kind of color blindness protocol, and it's just for everybody. Everybody lives in a world of justice, so long as you work hard, or however you want to describe that. Well, to be able to break through that is saying it does violate the color blindness protocol that still exists here in the US, that we don't talk about race and these matters, and even social justice. And it highlights the fear as we start to engage these issues of being oppressive. Am I racist? Am I sexist? Am I heterosexist? And the other ists. Fear associated with your own oppressive attitudes, behaviors, our privilege, personal responsibility to address oppression. All of those things can emerge. Well, let me share a little bit about a critical exchange with a colleague at Fuller, a white male colleague. We were talking about actually experience related to women in terms of bias and discrimination. And as we continue to talk, he said, you know, the direction we've been going at Fuller is important. I'm totally on board with it. I want to be a part of this. But you know, I don't want to be beaten up. I don't want to be beaten up as a white man. Now, I've heard some of my other colleagues speak about this. So I had a sense of connection around the idea because I'd heard this. And what I said to him was that, you know, as we've been talking, we know that before us is a path of some difficult conversations, important actions, pain, emotional struggle, spiritual struggle. And I hear you are committed to that. And we know it's going to be painful. But I also hear you saying that you don't want to be beat up in the midst of it. I'm saying to you, I don't want to beat you up. And in fact, I want you to let me know if in my efforts, there's actions that I take that feel like they're beating you up. I want you to call me to account. Let's have a conversation about that. I went on to say that as I move forward and play my role in this journey before us, I don't want to be beaten up for it. So I would like first for you to acknowledge that and for that not to happen toward me. But in the midst of it all, if either of us are engaged in that, can we have a brave enough space so that we could give one another that feedback and work through it? That was an example of accountability and honest communication and examination of where we are, and also a sharing of pain, past pain, as well as feared, anticipated future pain. Building on Diedenthal and Brouwer's findings about the fact that emotional expressiveness in general tends to promote group solidarity and more cohesive congregations, church congregations. Krause and Hayward were looking at a similar phenomena in selected Black congregations, particularly for people who were worshiping in these more emotionally expressive congregations. What they found was in those places where they shared pain and lament related to social injustice, it served to deepen the cohesion among the congregants. And not only were people more likely to believe that all people within the congregation were connected, it actually fostered connection with people outside the congregation. Common ground was found. Now, Ormond, in applying this kind of therapeutic technique in groups, one of the things we need to think about, you already hear that I'm highlighting the role of emotion. Part of the challenge around polarity is it is so emotional. We have strong opinions, but we also have strong emotions about these matters. And the main idea here is that we are actually not only need to increase our emotional intelligence, but our capacity to handle our own emotions and others as we move forward in addressing issues related to social justice. So we can learn from experts in group therapy, because part of it is that folks, group therapists, are particularly engaged in helping people manage their emotions interpersonally. So it's not just an individual experience, it's a group level. So he talks about bridging as a technique to strengthen the emotional connections between members or develop connections where they don't exist. Well, common ground, which we often don't even see in the midst of polarity, most of us want to be needed, to be accepted, to be heard, for our experience to matter, wherever we come from, whatever our religious background is or not. The challenge with polarity and division, it thrives on either or. You've got to pick a side. And more importantly, it blinds us to our connections. It blinds us. It does not mean they're not there, but it blinds us to it. Common ground, by contrast, acknowledges our differences and searches for both and. It's not premature connection. It's not false homogeneity, but it's a difference, appreciation of difference or uniqueness that finds common ground. Well, how might this apply for Division 36? Let's just reflect a moment. Well, one way to think about this, Division 36, in its development, creation of the Social Justice Task Force, is saying, we are going to take steps toward social justice. We want to make this commitment. We're working on what that means. Can that happen and past contributions matter? Those trees that have been there for a while, can that matter too? When I think about, I still appreciate so much the Handbook of Psychology, Religion, and Spirituality. That is a great resource. There were diverse voices, diverse populations, and even the intersection of cultural perspectives and religion and spirituality in a wonderful way. So that was such an important contribution. But there's still a need for stronger commitment to diversity in the journal, even as that commitment is stated, and clearly in the division. There's clearly more work to do. Well, let me share a little bit about my story with Division 36. I used to attend APA regularly. It's such a large meeting now, it's harder, but especially when I did regularly, I'd go to Division 36 events and talk with folks and found them very enlightening. And as my focus turned to spirituality and health, even more helpful to my work. As I was trying to join the division, though, in a couple of decades probably ago, a while ago, somehow it never happened. The application didn't go forward. I really don't even know what happened. Some kind of clerical, technical, I don't know. I just kind of let it go. I just thought, okay, I don't know what happened there. More recently, I was invited to serve on a committee, a special committee, which required me of Division 36, which required me to be a member. So once again, the membership process was underway. Well, again, some kind of paperwork snafu in terms of the processes. Now, what was helpful is, of course, the original experience was unwelcoming and discouraging, really. But once this happened, when I knew that people were invested, I said, okay, well, I think this is a structural issue. There's still some structural processes that are involved. But it did help me not take it personally. That's my story. I am clearly now more connected these days, but that has been part of my journey. Well, let's now shift to thinking about change and cultural competence. Just like the improvement of my sidewalk, like I described, something that can be an improvement, even if everybody agrees it's an improvement, can still cause anxiety and unexpected challenges and problems. Sometimes because of what's on the surface and sometimes because of what's lurking literally underneath. But change in general can be anxiety provoking as well as energizing for other folks. This table for me outlines in a helpful way the process of complex change. Now you see the 6 categories across the top on the top row, and then under the change, that final column, it's highlighting some of the challenges that missing elements in trying to negotiate change can bring about. Okay, so I want to highlight just a few of them. First, the experience of sabotage. That's the second listed there, 3rd row. It's on the right. Sabotage occurs when you may have a vision for change, but there isn't consensus. So things get undermined and sabotaged in different kinds of ways. Now let's move on down to frustration. You may have a vision, you may have consensus, even an action plan, but you don't have the resources to affect the change that you have in mind. That can lead to frustration. Now, both of these are common things that I see in organizations, but this last one is particularly something I've seen even more commonly. The treadmill. The way I describe that is a couple of steps forward and then a couple of steps back. That can even be more discouraging because you see some progress, but then it's not sustained. Well, what is often a major issue there? You've got vision, consensus, resources, those other dimensions, but you don't have an action plan. Many of us glaze over when we think about a strategic plan, but I'm talking about a real, clear, goal-focused plan with accountability. That can make all the difference between making change on an organizational, I might even say divisional level. That can be very important. Well, we know cultural competence is a familiar term. Here's one example of some of the key domains of it. Cultural humility is an important concept with the notion of honoring others' beliefs, customs, and values, and a continual process of self-exploration. Now, this isn't as easy to say, but cultural compatibility, I guess, kind of a cute little fusion, if you will, of cultural humility into cultural knowledge. I like this idea because it reminds us, no matter how much we know, or think we know. We need to walk with a measure of humility in general, but specifically cultural humility. Now, when we move forward to think about social justice, I just want to make a few comments about how we can think about social justice. I'm going to try to put this thing up here because I can see it. Let's see if that works better. Okay. Social justice, Mark McMahon and colleagues, there was a study we did that looked at students in explicitly Christian graduate programs. And what we found was there was more training in religious diversity for these students, but less training in ethnic, racial, and socioeconomic diversity. Now you see this is a relatively recent study. Now, why might that matter? That might mean that we may be producing from Christian programs, not other programs, but folks that don't do this blend of understanding religious diversity as well as these other dimensions need to be considered together. Cone in his Black Theology of Liberation notes that for some, Christianity is a theology of liberation. And this would be true for some other religions as well, where social justice is essential to one's religious faith. And from a Christian perspective, God's redemptive work in the world. But others, and even other Christian denominations, frankly, don't look at Christianity, don't look at social justice as central to one's faith. And some may not even consider it biblical. We've got varied perspectives on social justice. Well, let's look at what's involved in social justice competencies. This laying out what Flores et al. Have done, I think it's helpful to just get a sense of what are we more specifically potentially talking about. Now, self-awareness, valuing others, that's familiar from a cultural competency standpoint. It's these domains on the right that push a little further. So let's look at them in a little more detail. Knowledge of social inequality, understanding the history of inequity, structural racism, oppression, privilege. Now I'm aware that these are subject for debate because the polarities exist around this. But I bring us back to our principle C, I believe it is, in terms of integrity. We have to be honest and truthful about the reality of documented historical as well as contemporary inequities. So social justice competency includes knowing about this and understanding those histories. Now these competencies I find particularly helpful because the first three are what you might expect from a cultural competency lens and are very important. 4, 5, and 6 particularly highlight this interpersonal, emotional, relational dimension that I am emphasizing. Social justice competency involves the ability to deal with conflict due to cultural differences, engaging in difficult dialogues, addressing interpersonal and group issues. When I'm teaching diversity, I often use this phrase of developing multicultural muscles. Many of us have not worked as much on our multicultural muscles, but a lot of us have not worked on our emotional multicultural muscles, being able to manage our own and others' strong emotion. That's an important part of social justice competency and moving forward in this way. We also, some folks will be focused on garnering skills necessary to transform institutions and contribute to greater societal change. That's been a commitment that I've made following this past year, that I need to be more involved at a community level directly in areas that we might transform some of our institutions. So what are some of the implications? First, not only as therapists, but also as researchers, clinicians, but the researchers, administrators, professors, we need to consider our own formation in the sense of development of ourselves, developing the section B there that's highlighting the relational dynamics and experiential learning. Part of this is experiential learning. The richness of it is it helps you grow emotionally, strengthen you, develop you emotionally as well as interpersonally. Important dimensions that need attention. Then Sandage and his colleagues also talk about the important understanding the different ways of suffering, illness causation across sociocultural, spiritual, religious, and philosophical traditions. We need to understand that clinically, but we also need to understand that from a research standpoint. What are some of the applications? Well, lament. There's a way in which, what does lament mean? One way that understanding that from a biblical perspective is confronting God with the pain and the confusion that is things like the racial injustice, the pandemic queue up for us. So some of us might be angry at God, some of us might be angry at the universe. However, we would direct that place beyond us. Lament can work to first be unsettling emotionally because the intensity of it, but it actually can work towards strengthening a relationship, a commitment to one's faith or one's relationship with God. Dickey actually asked people in a poor community in Cape Town, South Africa, to develop their own laments in their experience. And this is what she noted, that to facilitate psychological healing for those who suffer trauma, it's important to provide space for the bearers of pain to lament, following the biblical pattern. This is similar, the notion of lament has been also looked at in military in response to moral injury, and the importance of lament, emotional expression, anger towards God. I want to highlight very quickly some work of a colleague of mine, Dr. David Allen. This is work that's been funded by Templeton World Charities in the Bahamas. Following the cocaine epidemic decades ago and the social injustice associated with it, they've had increased murders, family, people that know one another, killing one another. A mother will come to these group experiences with the funeral program of her daughter who was killed by somebody she knows. Now, what they've done is created these group experiences where people can come and express their grief, their empathy, but also their love and hope. They're trying to interrupt this perpetual cycle of violence. Violence, vengeance, violence, vengeance. So people come to this group, they share the depth of their pain and loss. And I've had the privilege of sitting in these groups and observing this. They share their anger and their rage. In all of this, they find common ground. They find community. Some are able to forgive and not perpetuate the cycle of violence, but be committed to infusing experiences like this in more community. The transformations that are happening in these groups are so phenomenal as gang leaders are becoming transformed and become lay leaders of these groups. Well, additional directions for future research. Wilt and his colleagues, the work that they've done, looking at suffering, that in times of struggle, and this was a study of over almost 3,000 undergraduates, those who hold benevolent theodicies, that suffering is part of a benevolent God's plan, are likely to come closer, both affectively and behaviorally, to a God who is perceived as supportive and loving during religious struggle. In contrast, those who have non-benevolent theodicies are likely to drift further away from a God who's perceived as cruel and unjust. So when we think about, I've already shared some potential areas of research, I do think we need to look at more concepts like lament and understanding more about that, suffering even more so. But I like how Sandage and his colleagues describe spirituality and research as relational. It not only matters what we study, but how we engage it. Do we attend to justice considerations and even social justice and how we relate to one another? Yes, in our divisions, but even in our research teams. I'm really very thankful for Crystal Park's clear vision related to the diversity needs to be embraced value for the journal. And all these dimensions of diversity, I know the recent special issue on LGBTQ+, which is wonderful contribution. All articles, no matter what the focus, need to address diversity issues in their analyses and discussions. And what about when we're reviewing other articles with this journal and other journals, that we highlight attention to that? So in conclusion, what implications might this have for leaders and administrators? Is social justice a core value in our models? This is what I like about Sandage's relational spirituality approach. He does incorporate that. That's a wonderful example for us. What would it be to have a special issue, something related to religion and spirituality in a social justice context, or working with that notion? Our world is suffering unlike ever before. We might be tended to disconnect because of the pain and because of the injustice. Some of the work I've already highlighted shows you innovative, creative, socially justice-focused approaches that work in the midst of that pain and find common ground. That is our opportunity. The opportunity for strategic outreach in many ways that's committed to inclusion. And this is a definition of inclusion I particularly appreciate. Inclusion exists when traditionally marginalized individuals and groups feel a sense of belonging and are empowered to shape and redefine culture. Not just a sense of belonging, but power is also shared. Here are some of my references. Thank you so much for your attention, and I will now entertain questions.